Welcome. My name is Madeline Lewis. I'm the head of communications here at the Transcap Initiative. And we're delighted that you can join us. Today, we've got Santosh Ramdas, who is Gary Community Ventures President and CEO and Chief Investment Officer, and Catherine Toner, who's Gary's Managing Director of Impact Investing. I hope I've got all that right. And as well as Santosh and Catherine, we have Johannes from Transcap Initiative, myself, and we've got Hannah, who you may see at some point or perceive working away in the background, making sure that all the tech works. So thanks, Hannah, for doing that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kick off with an introduction to systemic investing and a bit about how this case study came about, where it came from, and our relationship with Gary. I'll then do a fireside chat with Santosh and Catherine to get the story from the horse's mouth, as it were. And then there'll be plenty of time to have your questions as well. You can share your questions at any point through the Q&A chat box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to put your questions in there throughout, and then we'll come to them at the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So great. Thank you. Just check if we've got... Great. So without further ado, I will hand over to Johannes. Johannes is part of the Transcap Initiative team, and he's going to start us off with an introduction.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. I'm just going to bring up some slides. Great, here we are. So welcome also from my end. I have the pleasure of doing a bit of a monologue at the beginning of this webinar and talking about systemic investing, what it is, why it is relevant, and why Gary Community Ventures is such a great example of systemic investing in practice. So let's kick it off. Systemic investing. Why do we even need to talk about this? As many of you who are here today are probably acutely aware, we are in a context where transforming our real economy systems is the ultimate task of our times. And those systems are food and ag, energy, transportation, industrial supply chains, the built environment, you name it. All of those don't just need to change incrementally, but we need to bring about deep, lasting, and transformative change. Now, this raises the question, how do we go about financing such systems change? And what is the role of all the different types of financial capital in this transformative effort? And this question really sits at the heart of everything that we do at the Transcap Initiative. And our conceptual starting point for this work and for systemic investing at large is very nicely captured through this single dot that you can see on the screen. We know from research that systems change is rarely, if ever, the result of a single technology or a single piece of infrastructure or a single social enterprise. But how kind of finance and lots of the work around financing and funding is set up at the moment is exactly this specific focus on single solutions. What the real world and research tells us is that we need instead to look at a whole web of factors. And those might be things like different business models, new pieces of infrastructure, changes in the policy and regulation regime, but also changes in social norms and behaviors and practices. And all of these also need to be combined because shifts in the end, deep transformative shifts happen when all of these things change in a combined manner across multiple domains. So what we need for systems change to occur is not a focus on isolated pieces of technology or interventions at large, but we need an integrated strategic portfolio of interventions. And looking at this challenge through the lens of finance, this means that funding systems change essentially boils down to creating a funding architecture that spans all different types of capital anchored in the financing needs, transition financing needs of a system, which means the big challenge of our time is matching the right type of capital to the right kind of intervention at the right moment in time. And this really entails all different types of capital. So this brings us to one of the first key pieces of information on how to do systemic investing. Instead of using only one specific tool, we need to be much more effective in mobilizing the entire tool set across finance. And that might be anything from typical grants, PRIs, MRIs, private sector investment capital, risk transfer mechanisms, public sector instruments, or also corporate finance. The thing, though, that's obviously quite clear to all of you is that no single organization has control over all of these different tools. What we also need with these different tools is to align them and bring them in strategic coordination and deploy them in a way that is coherent and synergistic. So what you can see here on the right side of the screen is a conceptual diagram of something that we call an investment architecture, which essentially showcases different types of financial capital deployed in coherence and alignment. And as I mentioned before, those might be funded with return-seeking capital, so investment capital, investment vehicles through debt, VC, or maybe also blended finance structures. And those need to be aligned with philanthropic money, which can be deployed maybe as a policy design initiative or a grant mechanism, but then also other types of financing, public sector, subsidies, taxes, corporate finance like market commitments, supply chain finance instruments, and also de-risking mechanisms and insurance products. And now the main issue that we have is that, as mentioned before, obviously no single stakeholder holds and controls all of these tools at once. Instead, if we kind of try to conceptualize the present and how we try to solve complex issues, what we have is lots of engaged stakeholders sitting at the problem-solving table, looking very hard at a complex societal issue that you can see here through this nice scribble. But they don't really talk to each other in a very effective manner. Instead, what happens is all of these asset owners or asset managers, they look at the problem through the lens of their specific tool, which means an insurer is looking for possibilities to insure products, create risk transfer mechanisms that in the end create some value for themselves. Foundations might look for the perfect grant-making opportunity that gives them the most impact bang for the buck. And asset managers, they look for specific returns, as you all know. But what we need is all of these stakeholders to work together, use their tools in an integrated, strategically coherent manner. And this is essentially what systemic investing is about. When we talk about systemic investing, it's addressing all of these imperatives. And we would describe it as a capital deployment approach that is designed to transform real economy systems. And you can sort of think of it as the next stage in the evolution of multilateral development finance, impact investing, philanthropy, and strategic public finance. Put all of those approaches together, season them a bit with systems thinking, systems innovation, and mission-oriented policy. And what you get out of the grinder is essentially systemic investing. What are the key imperatives for systemic investing? First, we say capital needs to be deployed strategically, so in pursuit of a clear transformational intent, guided by a systemic theory of transformation and based on systemic intelligence. Second, capital needs to be deployed in an integrated fashion, so across the entire capital spectrum, as we've established before. And third, capital needs to be deployed with a strong focus on context, so in specific places, specific supply chains, and across different scales of the system in inclusive and participatory ways. If you want to learn more about systemic investing, we have lots of written artifacts that you can look into that lay out the why. A white paper that was published a few years back when Transcap started out. We have a lot more around what it is, the key hallmarks and key tenets of systemic investing, and by now also several pieces of publications that look deep into the how systemic investing can play out in practice. And this is ultimately what all of our work at the Transcap Initiative focuses on. We exist to build the field of systemic investing and establish the conceptual and practical foundations of it. And we do so in collaboration with a great many partners. And most of our work falls, actually all of our work falls into three different areas: research and conceptual development, which is about identifying, naming, and defining the ideas that sit at the heart of systemic investing, prototyping, which is essentially about putting these ideas into practice, and then network weaving, which is about all the relational work that needs to happen around it. So that is convening, education, storytelling, advocacy, and the like. And organizationally, we're structured as a tax-exempt not-for-profit, and we happen to be registered in Switzerland, which is also where we were started and founded, but we operate as a small but mighty team of 8 across the globe in Switzerland, the UK, and Brazil. Now, why are we all here today? We want to talk about one of our case studies. The case studies, just to locate this piece of work, they are essentially an attempt to showcase that systemic investing isn't just a conceptual idea, but it is already practiced by a lot of pioneers out there, and lots of the ideas that we talk about in conceptual language already exist in practice. So we try to profile some of these pioneering initiatives, learn from them, showcase how some of our ideas might advance their work, but also implement and integrate some of their thinking into our own conceptual pieces. We have written quite a few case studies by now, and a few weeks ago, we released our latest one on Gary Community Ventures, and specifically on their housing work. So let me talk a little bit about Gary, who they are, what they do, why they exist, and why we find them so interesting and intriguing. So by way of introduction, Gary was founded by Sam and Nancy Gary, who believe strongly that economic and social prosperity are interdependent and strongly entwined and cannot be separated out. So the whole mission and vision of Gary is to improve the lives and livelihoods of children and families in the state of Colorado. So strongly focused on a specific context, strongly focused on a specific mission with families at the heart. The philanthropic work of the Garys already started in the 1950s, was then later institutionalized into a precursor foundation. And then Gary Community Ventures as such and as a coherent brand came about in 2021. Now, the vision that I just showcased and introduced is also formally conceptualized by focusing on 3 outcome areas. Those are school readiness, youth success, and family economic mobility, all integrative elements to family well-being, and being able to realize opportunities for kids and families. And Gary tries to work towards these outcomes by focusing on the deep-rooted systemic barriers that impede them. So hence the kind of big primary goals of the organization to transform systems and transform all the systems that shape these outcome areas and build wealth for families and children to be able to realize opportunities. And they do so by focusing on 3 areas, which sound quite broad now, but we're going to go a bit into detail what all of this means. They try to advance innovative programs and policies. They invest in leadership, and they have a strong focus on changing narratives. Now, as I said, our work focused specifically on housing. Why housing? We didn't really see that on the previous slide. Well, at Gary, they realized that for the outcome area of family economic mobility, housing is a quintessential foundational element. It's a stabilizing factor for family well-being. It's a foundational pathway for wealth building and for long-term economic mobility. So a key systemic issue to address. And at the same time, all of this unfolds in the context of a housing crisis, an affordable housing crisis, specifically in the state of Colorado, where the vast majority of Coloradans view the cost of housing as a grave concern. There's an increasing supply shortage, with about 40% fewer units of affordable housing being built over the previous decade than in previous years. And also the number of units, housing units that are deemed affordable has reduced quite dramatically over the previous years. So Gary formulated a theory of transformation of how to address the housing shortage and solve the housing issue more broadly. And that theory focuses on reducing household expenses, because housing is one of the key household expenses, and thus opening up more opportunities for families. allowing families to build wealth through home ownership, and then addressing the foundational root causes of the housing landscape more broadly by investing in leadership and lots of different organizations that try to tackle the issue. Now, when the folks at Gary looked at the financing gap for housing, they came up with a figure of about $350 million annually that would be needed for the next 20 years. And it practically goes without saying that a foundation, a place-based foundation, can never shoulder these kind of sums of money and fill this financing gap in and of itself. So this begs the question, how did Gary go about addressing this very systemic and huge issue in the context of Colorado? So the key thing, and I think this is also one of the key things that we always talk about when we talk about systemic investing, is that Gary didn't start by limiting itself and trying to think what can or can't we do based on the resources we have and the tools that we have at our disposal. But instead, they looked out at the housing system in Colorado and tried to investigate where are the leverage points that we can tackle and what are interventions that we might be able to undertake that can meaningfully move the dial in this specific context. So very strong system first, outside in perspective that Gary applied. And so one of the key issues they focused on first is the aforementioned financing gap for housing. So what they had found a few years ago is that one of the most important public levers for delivering social housing at the national level, the low-income housing tax credit, has several shortcomings. It focuses on a particular segment of median income, broadly speaking, below 60%. And this means that there essentially exists a gap between housing that's incentivized by this tax credit and housing that's incentivized by the broader market. And this gap is what they figured requires most financing and where all funding and investment activities should focus on. So they started to deploy one of their tools in their arsenal of tools, which is impact investing, and started to invest. Here are just a couple of initiatives that they invested in. One is the Colorado Housing Accelerator Initiative, and one is the Enterprise Renter Wealth Creation Fund. Broadly speaking, both deploy equity and debt instruments to really target this identified housing gap between where the market doesn't yet support or incentivize developers and the public support system doesn't sufficiently fill the gap. So these are a couple of impact investments they undertook, but as we said before, the housing gap in itself is huge, 350 million per year. So that quickly led to the realization that they also need to deploy another tool in their arsenal and start to engage around regulation and see if there is a chance to change the regulatory environment and unlock much more funding for this piece of work. So in 2022, they did see an opportunity to scale these innovations that I mentioned before that focus on specific gap-filling funding. And they launched a citizen-led ballot initiative titled Proposition 123 with the specific intention to channel over $300 million annually into affordable housing development in Colorado. The proposition was designed to specifically address three gaps that exist, and that's match financing for existing incentives from the public. It's funds that provide concessionary equity and debt to incentivize more workforce rental developments, and it's down payment assistance for homeowners. So essentially, Prop 123 was designed to work like a more effective public sector subsidy to real estate developers so that they can achieve market rate financial returns without having to charge excessive rents and driving the affordability crisis further and further. So Prop 123 was launched and Gary was an instrumental player. They acted as a convener and as an integrator. They brought together a bipartisan steering committee of over 15 organizations, engaged several partners and consultants, supported on policy design, and provided guidance and research on all aspects of the proposition, which was ultimately also successful and signed into law a few years ago. So another big piece to focus on closing the affordable housing financing gap and bringing much more money into this market. But there are also other leverage points that Gary addressed that are key to building lasting family wealth. One is related to renter wealth building. So this is another important feature of Gary. They have the capacity and always try to figure out how can they deploy funding in a very innovative manner to unlock some of these deep-rooted issues. And in this case, they launched an innovation experiment in the context of Chai, an investment I mentioned previously, where they collectively try to figure out how can we ensure that renters participate in the wealth that's being generated for, at the moment, just real estate developers when the value of these real estate developments increases. So they designed a vehicle together with their investees, the tenant equity vehicle that lets residents in the housing portfolio participate in the fund profits and in accrued value of the housing portfolio through monthly cashbacks and annual profit share. And this is an instrument that they were able to test, as I said, in the context of the Colorado Housing Initiative, but then we're also able to integrate in the design of Prop 123. So an innovative kind of instrument that was initially tested and then scaled to a statewide level through this housing proposition. And then another leverage point that they focused on that is key in driving the housing crisis, land ownership. And this is something Gary has been working on for many decades. So actually the precursor organization of Gary helped establish the Urban Land Conservancy and the Elevation Community Land Trusts, both essentially holding land in trust to ensure that it doesn't get inordinately expensive for residents that live there, and essentially leads to local communities being priced out of city centers and other areas within Colorado. And also these initiatives, they kind of had been established within Gary, launched there, incubated there, supported there financially, and now they are two standalone initiatives that are still receiving some grant-making support from Gary, but have become their own important entities in the Colorado housing system. So one of the key things here, just to underline, Gary started not by asking what can we do with the money and the tools and the resources we have, but looking out at Colorado and trying to figure out what are these pertinent issues and leverage points, and how can we then go back to all the tools that we have and deploy them effectively and in a coherent and integrated manner to solve Colorado's housing crisis. So those four tools, they're being deployed through three different entities: Gary Philanthropy, Gary Ventures, and Gary Advocacy. And we try to create a nice overview and conceptual diagram of the workings of Gary that you can see here, which includes some of the investment investees that I mentioned before, like the Colorado Housing Accelerator Initiative or the Enterprise Renter Wealth Creation Fund. So all of these kind of yellow diamonds signifying investees or investment vehicles funded with return-seeking capital, but then also, as mentioned, lots of philanthropic activities, a dedicated capital pool for venture incubation that was used, for example, to establish the Urban Land Conservancy and the Elevation Community Land Trust, and then also a standalone capital pool situated in Gary Advocacy for housing-related policy and advocacy work. And all of the activities within Gary's systemic investment program, they are aligned with activities outside of Gary's control. And the key thing here, also mentioned before, Proposition 123, a big publicly funded program that really accelerated the supply of affordable housing units in Colorado over the previous years. There's much more to say about this, but if any of you wants to learn more about all these different interventions, we profiled all of them in our case study and showcased how they work together, how they came about, what the underlying theory of transformation is, and how they support the overarching goal of family economic mobility. And just the key thing to say here is, this is a key example of systemic investing in practice. with a clear strategic focus, aligned with an outcome area, integrated deployment of different types of capital, and contextualized in this case, the context of the state of Colorado. And the last point I want to make before we hear from the Gary team and the leaders within is that all of this happens with a very interesting constraint. Gary operates with a sunsetting clause and plans to cease operations by 2035. The sunsetting clause was inscribed into the statutes of Gary through its founders. And Gary is a very interesting case study showcasing how organizational impermanence and long-term systemic change are actually not at odds, but maybe they might even be two factors that work together quite nicely. So again, if you take a look at the case study, some very interesting elaborations on how a sunsetting clause can actually help and free and create more flexibility for an organization that tries to pursue lasting systemic change. And one of the things that Gary does to make sure that all the work that it does now continues beyond its own existence is convening, is changing narratives, and is building and investing in leadership. You can see here an image of a recent convening that brought together different innovators, instigators, and implementers, as Gary likes to refer to them, and with a specific focus on housing, trying to amplify and build connections that can outlast Gary itself. And with that quick introduction and some of the highlights that we have written up in the case study, I want to pause here and stop here and hand it back to my colleague because we have the great pleasure of hearing from some of the experts themselves. And as Madeline mentioned, we have Santosh with us, who is the President, CEO, and Chief Investment Officer, and Catherine, Managing Director of Impact Investing. We've had the pleasure to engage with both in the context of writing this case study. Had some very interesting discussions and long conversations, and it is a great pleasure to have them and hear from them and talk to them about how all of this came about.
Thanks, Johannes. Thanks so much. And for those of you who've joined us slightly later, I've just posted the link to the case study in the chat there, so you should be able to have a look. It's on our website, so you can come back to that at any time. So thank you, Santosh and Catherine, for joining us. Let's hear the story now through your experiences and insights. Santosh, I might kick off with you if that's all right. So as Johannes has taken us through very thoroughly, Gary blends philanthropic and investment capital and policy. Now, of course, there are other foundations out there who have a similar tool set at their disposal. But what for you makes Gary's approach different? What makes you unique?
Yeah, thank you all for hosting us. I think it was a bit of a surreal experience to read the case study, to hear it from Johannes and his soothing voice back to what we've done. It's kind of like it felt very different, and I'm sure Catherine feels this way. Well, I mean, I think one of the things we want to hopefully do through the case study is not make it very special what Gary has done. I feel like there's a foundation in every state in the United States, at least, which cares about housing deeply, has had the resources that Gary does, and they could take some of these tools and approaches and implement them. And I think that the unique aspect of our thinking here is that we were holding the responsibility for the overall system collectively as an organization. So while we could have been somewhat content with the fact that we've made successful catalytic investments in housing and kind of counted the small incremental change there, we did feel like our board entrusted with the overall goal of saying we want you to think about transforming the overall system. And that required us to not just hand off part of the system to someone else. Now, this is not that we didn't have partnerships, but typically what other foundations might do is say, we'll give you a grant, go do X or Y or Z. I think what made Gary unique in this case a little bit is that you would have seen from those diagrams in the case study that our policy team held the responsibility of making sure we work with the community to pass the legislation and the ballot measure. Our investment team worked integrated with the policy team. So it's one unit of change in a way, and that was unique. And then the other piece is that we're very close to the ground. In a way, this case study came out of the work we were doing. And when Dominic and I went for a walk in SoCap, he started talking about systemic investing, and then I mirrored back to him, say, this sounds like a lot of what we do. But we were just doing it from a ground up in terms of what was needed in community. And so I know there was a bit of I want to add two more things, but I just want to say more broadly, it's not that crazy. It's very doable, and hopefully other communities can step in and say philanthropy can be more of an instrument of systemic change here. The two other pieces that are unique is, one is, I think culturally we are distinct as an organization, and you might see this between Catherine and I in this call. We take the work really seriously. We don't take ourselves very seriously. And what that does is it opens the aperture of ideas that are allowable. So we don't have the philanthropic kind of the traditional mindset of like, we can only let some things into this organization. I think it's a very distinct culture that people notice sometimes. It's a little jarring, but it's also fun. And it brings that sense of like making mistakes, being not very hierarchical. Anybody can push back on anybody else. And that gives us the ability to kind of imagine a world that doesn't exist, which is what we're tasked to do. And then the last thing is the people. I would say I'm glad Catherine is here and she's going to jump in and talk. But if you think about investment team members, they're very good at kind of the analytical discipline of making really good investments. But we have unique folks that can work across our dimensions. So she's a very close ally to our policy work. And she comes with not just like a traditional banking experience of being able to sit in rooms with bankers and be honest, but she's also able to go into and testify in front of the Colorado Capitol on a piece of legislation. And I just want to say that is one of the magical things that we often forget, is that when foundations hire, they hire like really type A, strong, smart people, but they're not like malleable in a way. And we're just lucky to have phenomenal talent that kind of like straddles between sectors and is comfortable in those two places. And that's kind of what we need within systems. So I just want to flag a couple of pieces that are maybe in the report a little bit, which is on the cultural side and on the talent side, which kind of drives a lot of what we do.
I think I'm right in saying as well, Santosh, aren't I, that almost your entire team lives and works in Colorado, or in fact in Denver. So you have that as people, you're very much part of that system, right? Which is really interesting. And I'm sure that must influence how you think, how you work together. The visibility of it, being part of it is really interesting, I think. Not always the case. I might ask Catherine now, as you've mentioned, Catherine. This idea of your policy work was really, really interesting to us. And you've really integrated policy innovation into your strategy. Catherine, Santosh said you're a real ally to the policy team. Can you share how you think about the role of policy in driving systems change, and then also how you practically align that, your investing, your partnerships, and your advocacy to achieve these policy outcomes?
Yeah. Thank you for having us today. I echo Santosh's sentiments. Johannes's very calm voice puts a layer above what was very chaotic for several years. So it's great to see it packaged this way. But I think to your point, Madeline, the policy piece for us is kind of non-traditional. We think about C4 investing here in the States and kind of a very constricted support of existing coalitions, of existing ballot measures, of existing candidates. The way that we've tried to unleash or change that paradigm is really in writing the policy and kind of providing a model for what we think could be and should be, in Sam Gary's quote of what could be, should be. And I think policy, as we think about it, is I'm a more traditional markets person. So when we look at a intervention or an innovation, really seeing what the sustainability looks like. We're not providing kind of classic subsidy to existing markets to perpetuate the same behavior. It's really identifying how that innovation can be sustained. And it's looking then at the cash flow of that sustainable archetype. If it is a market-oriented solution, we try to support that and scale that through our investments over time to scale through markets. If it is a below market rate or more subsidy-oriented structure, policy for us is the best path to scale, using public dollars and using public infrastructure as the scaled investor, taking that concession essentially, but creating a sustainable structure within that. So when we kind of look at that systems level, what is the problem? What is the potential solution? How do we test what that actually looks like? Let's identify what kind of the cash flow profile is of that solution, and then find the pathway to scale within that paradigm. So as you mentioned, it's oftentimes walking down the hall. We're all in person, which is an asset for us working in community, and just bouncing ideas off of the policy team, kind of throwing crazy stuff on the wall. And then they tell me if that's a realistic potential solution given the dynamics at the legislature, the coalitions that are surrounding certain topics or ideas. And so I come in, and Santosh comes in as like kind of the batshit crazy person who's like, is this possible? What about this idea? And then they kind of put the reality around it. But when there is a path forward, it's a really powerful partnership to just really get more hands-on on the design piece of it, rather than kind of providing just traditional grant making or traditional C4 dollars to support those efforts, which is non-traditional, but is also really fun.
Just for the record, Catherine does come up with her own batch of crazy ideas. So she just, I mean, and one of those instances I do want to underpin is like, it's a great example of like, she was in a room and she wouldn't do this because she's like super humble. But like, one of those was like, what would the world look like if renters were not just being financially declining, but what would it look like if we gave them an upside on the part of the wealth that we're helping generating in being renters in multifamily properties? It came from her work in employee ownership. And so we kind of started playing around with this idea. And it's a great example of something that feels absurd and crazy when you start talking about it the first time, mm-hmm. but then it slowly becomes normalized if you have the imagination and the systems level scale to do that, which is kind of what became part of Prop 123 and now the renter wealth building work. I just want to say, I want to make for the record that I'm not the only batch of crazy person since
it's now been recorded.
We were in that together.
It's on camera now. Do you know, one of the things I found so interesting about your story and the case study we wrote about you is this idea of intuition and the role that intuition has in your organization. And you've said that when working on systems change, you often have to lead with intuition and feel your way forward, which is not something people often talk about because analysis is considered more important, isn't it? So can you share a specific moment at Gary? I'm aiming this one at you, Catherine, but for either of you. Can you share a specific moment at Gary where intuition shaped a major investment or strategic decision and what you learned from it? Perhaps that example you just brought up, Santosh, I don't know.
Yeah, that was certainly part of it. I think, again, with the markets context, intuition's usually a matter of identifying returns, having a good feeling about a founder, having confidence in the track record and presentation of a fund manager that kind of leads you to dig in further in the private markets. And the position Santosh and I sit in kind of between that policy and market intersection is really identifying where something conceptually feels strong or possible, and then kind of doing the back end work and analysis to understand kind of why it would work and what context it could be implemented in. And so I'd say even backing up from the tenant equity vehicle, our initial foray into employee ownership was a huge moment of intuition and really distilling. So we invested in a fund called A&H Capital Partners, Fund 1, very early on, right after I joined in 2021. It relies on an ESOP conversion model, so a tax incentive here in the States that incentivizes owners to convert their full company into an employee ownership structure that uses a trust model. But at its very core, when we were looking at the opportunity, is an LBO. It's a leveraged buyout in a traditional market context. And so without getting into the nerdy details, which I do far too easily, there was an intuitive moment that was like, oh, this has the potential to be really powerful, where you're using a traditional market structure of a leveraged buyout using some equity, but then leverage to convert an asset. But instead of the asset benefiting a private equity firm that's focused on like completely stripping operations, increasing profitability to the maximum, and then selling that asset, you're selling that to the employees themselves to help them generate wealth and participate in the upside that they help to generate at the core of the operations of that company. And so that was an intuitive moment for us of like, oh, this is like really cool. There's a market tool that is being completely flipped on its head to benefit a completely different set of stakeholders, and happen to be the stakeholders that we care most about here at Gary. And so that investment and that kind of commitment to employee ownership became then the analysis and understanding the model really deeply. But it did come from a very intuitive moment in making those connections between two very different kind of sectors of social impact and very hardcore extractive capitalist tendencies. So that was a piece of it. And then, as Santosh mentioned, it kind of led to our thinking about the tenant equity vehicle, which was also an intuitive moment. But yeah, I'll leave that example there.
Fascinating. One for either of you. It obviously comes through deeply in this case study that your emphasis on relationships and feedback loops with the communities that you serve. And we talked about walking and living in these communities as well. But how do you operationalize it? What are the practices, the structures that help ensure that those insights really shape and drive strategy rather than just sitting alongside it? How does that work?
You want me to take it? Okay.
Go on, Santosh.
Well, I think we're learning more. I will be honest in saying that being a foundation and a pool of resources gives you a certain amount of isolation, and you sit in a fancy office and you kind of look down in a way, and there are not a lot of incentives for us to naturally be in community. But I think we had to break that barrier, because coming back to the earlier question, the intuition in systems change comes from listening and being with community, because I think the largest and the most significant change happens not just through the technical details of what the systems need to be, but it's the human part of how do you get people to come along in that journey, because humans are basically the biggest component of systems. And so what we've done is institutionalize that now. So we have a new platform called CDIG. It's not new, it's been around for a year and a half. And what we've done is impaneled about 1,000 households that are in different levels of privilege but marginalization across our communities. And anytime we have an idea that we think is really cool and we think it's fun or crazy or game changing, we ground truth with that community, and they're remunerated for this. And then the coolest part of it is the turnaround on all of this is about a week. And so we can go back to community, get feedback quickly on any idea. There's a lot of synthesis and transcription, et cetera, using AI that makes it faster. But the humans in the loop part of it is probably the most precious asset that we have as an institution. And by the way, now it's like lots of other folks come and leverage it, because they're like, the traditional path of doing a survey and coming back with results after 8 months is not going to work for systems change. And so we have kind of institutionalized that as part of our core practice to say, how do we stay really close to community, but also like actually capital C community of like listening to folks and bringing their voice. And how do you make that part of our day-to-day operating model? So I feel like that's very cool. People can check it out. It's cdig.org to understand that. Jess, who runs that, is phenomenal. I don't know, anything else you would add, Catherine, also?
I would just point to to be completely candid, like we've operationalized it on the back end. A lot of this is like fumbling through the dark in a systems change context, and becomes very clear on the backside. But I think the other piece is just pilots, like using both grant and investment capital to test the thing before going to scale, both to understand, as we were discussing earlier, the cash flow profile and the pathway to scale, but also to get community feedback and actually get data about how effective that intervention or innovation is. And a huge part of that is how it works for community. And if it doesn't, then scale is not going to work. And so having those answers early on and having a toolbox with several tools to do that initial testing up front is a tremendous part of how we explore different options.
Yeah. We've talked a lot today, haven't we, about this idea of toolboxes and that the need to flex between different tools. And I think my next question is going to be about mindsets as well. Because lots of organizations will say they want systems change, but still operate in these more traditional models through discrete programs, discrete grants. And what is it about those kind of mindsets, perhaps organizational governance, those capabilities that an organization needs to truly adopt a systemic approach? How do you work as an organization? How have you enabled the team to operate that kind of systemic systems mindset?
Yeah, and I understand why organizations kind of stick to the discrete because it's very scary to operate in the. I mean, you don't we Catherine and I were in a bar in November of 2022, and there's a pretty good chance that Prop 123 was not going to pass on the election night. It was very clear. It was actually a pretty long shot, and it's heart and
To be
soul. You
clear,
put a
we
lot
were
of
at a bar for the results of the ballot measure, not just randomly in a bar in November 2022.
It was a watch party. It was a watch party. And it took 3 days for the final results to come in, and we won by I think 2 percentage points. But it's like you're kind of betting a significant amount of the house on this, which is scary. And as a leader, it's a hard thing to, and as a team to stomach that. And so I do understand why it can be slightly challenging for philanthropic organizations. And I also think that 90% of work I do now is enabling our team to work effectively, but also really focusing on the culture we need to enable that kind of mindset to flourish, which I think we've done a phenomenal job of just because of the quality of the team. Because it's like things like feeling your way around it, failing consistently, and like struggling to know what's going to happen, not having a perfect plan that's laid out. All of those are like pretty challenging for any team, right? Like they're like, but how are we going to measure like performance? Like, what's the outcomes look like? Can we have like a nice table to share with our board that this is what happened? And a lot of those answers are no. And it's about like, hey, we got to go through this with a lot more differentiated mindset. So I would say that's probably why this is somewhat scary. But I also say at the same time, if you think about philanthropy more broadly, the level of wealth and how creative that pool of capital is meant to be, if anybody is incentivized to do this kind of systems change, it's us. It's like we don't have a bottom line in a traditional sense. We're not going to get voted out in the next 4 years. We're not going to have cute quarterly revenue numbers we need to show. Our survival, the only reason we exist is to be there and take risks the rest of the society doesn't want to take. So it's counterintuitive to me that sometimes we as a foundation are tempted to take the least amount of risk. And so I feel like it comes down to why we exist, which is to drive systems change, which you ask any foundation, they'll say the answer is yes. It's just a different bodily experience to go through that. Because sometimes you wake up and you're like, I don't know what's happening. This is kind of crazy. And we don't know if this is going to happen or not. And I think you just need to have a really strong cultural foundation to make that happen.
And I guess as well that the thing with systems is that they're always changing, right? So you might find the answer on one thing and then the next day realize that answer isn't relevant anymore. And the challenge has renewed and found itself organized in different ways. So yeah, great. Well, that brings us to this 2035 sunset. So 9 years away. So that creates a real sense of urgency and clarity, I imagine. So how has having this fixed end date changed the way you prioritize, especially when you're balancing immediate impact with building those lasting networks, leaders, and structures that will carry the work forward? What do these last 9 years look like?
It's yeah. We're figuring it out now. We are. It's imperfect. It's kind of a rare structure. I joined Gary. I moved across the country because of Gary's structure of being 100% invested for impact and being a sunset organization that spurs tremendous risk. And a huge part of that is shifting how we define risk, and being very open to it. The fail forward moniker that is often mocked, like is real in our culture, and Santosh has created an excellent culture to support and celebrate that. We have fail fests at every
Brilliant.
annual meeting where we share something that completely imploded or some parts worked and some parts didn't. And I've been a ready participant in a couple of those. But it is really, I think, thinking about a more holistic endowment. We have to think differently about how to compartmentalize risk. So we have more traditional investments that are invested for impact, that are have positive returns, that we're kind of tracking a manager over time and supporting their development to hopefully get to that institutional level of capital raise and implementation of their strategy that just makes good market sense in that kind of paradigm of policy versus a market solution. And so like that's the kind of steady Eddie pieces of the portfolio. But the other kind of more experimental place-based side, we make kind of a concerted decision. And with 9 years left, the challenge really is between opportunistic investments or policy decisions today versus actually kind of establishing a vision for even 3, 4, 5 years from now, when we do still exist and still have resources to dedicate to a broader vision of like what a holistic system could look like. And those things can be complementary. Obviously, you can build up a policy decision today in this legislative session that complements and expands to a broader vision. But sometimes those things are intention and require intention in resources, like who is working on what, to what extent, and what political and social capital do we put toward that effort, and at what cost to the 3, 4, 5 year vision of what could be. And so from an investments perspective and a policy perspective, we think really about our investments now within a framework of it needs to check at least one of the boxes of creating upstream innovation that removes systemic barriers. So things that we can learn from and innovations that we believe have potential but are still very much in a small private markets context. The second is an opportunity to test for scale. So creating the funky financial structures or the funky policy ideas, or the grant to support an external organization that's doing something really cool that we see the opportunity to scale in that 3 to 4 year context. And then the third is really a model for infrastructure when we go away. Sam, our founder, explicitly wanted us not to be a spend down foundation. So sunset and spend down are often synonymous, but he explicitly shared the vision that he wants us to transfer our assets from our balance sheet to the balance sheet of community. And so a lot of that is thinking very like 1 year, 3 to 4 years, and then the 9 years of what do we have to do now to establish the infrastructure that can be enduring and absorb the resources and assets from our balance sheet. And right now we're in the testing mode of that. So long answer to say, we're still figuring it out. We have an investments framework with three directions that support the near term, midterm, and long term in our context goals, and then really situating risk and our perception of risk, and all of our board members and investment committee members that are very much aligned and supportive of us along the way and taking that risk.
And you talk about that infrastructure, building that infrastructure or supporting that infrastructure for the future. And of course, it's people that are a huge part of that, right? What are you kind of seeing in this, if not next generation of leaders, but the leaders that are here now that you're hopefully going to support? What are you seeing in them? What are you excited about there?
Yeah, a lot of my colleague Emily Williams oversees our partnership work here at Gary, which translates from essentially the traditional philanthropy context of partnership building and having meetings to what she's leading on the systems change side and convening side is really identifying those leaders in those positions today, but also identifying the folks that we know will be working on an issue or they kind of embody the passion in addressing that issue that will be a long-term kind of career pursuit and reducing the barriers to them interacting. So like in the same way that we like to combine grant making, investment capital, and policy innovation, putting those people in the same room to have a very open dialogue with very intentional screens and barriers removed to kind of get down to the core of an issue and problem solve and reduce risk for other folks in being in those spaces is, I think, a large part of what we'll be doing in the next 9 years to make sure that the enduring kind of infrastructure, human infrastructure, has the right communication nodes.
Great, thank you. Well, let's move over to some of the questions. I'm going to bring Johannes back in. We have a few questions in the chat. You can either put them in the chat or you can also put them into the Q&A box. I've lost Johannes. There you are.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'd just like to dig a little bit deeper on the sunset first, because I think this is also going to be a nice segue to some of the questions. I remember we had a very interesting conversations in the lead up to writing this case study around how this sunset actually liberates you as an organization and how you think it actually aligns quite well with the intention of creating lasting systems change. And I'd love if you could lay that out for all of us, because when I first heard it, it didn't seem intuitive to me. But then thinking it through, it sounded like a very well thought through philosophical argument. So Sandra, if you want to lay that out for us, that would be brilliant.
I love the fact that you also call it a philosophical argument, which is kind of like, I'm like a part-time philosopher, which I am. But I think we are, the hypothesis, and it does feel like, we're from a point of advantage because we're sunsetting, but the hypothesis is if you're going away, things become clearer and you are clear about what you want to leave behind. And part of it is if you want to leave behind a world that is much better than when you started doing this work and it persists to be much better, the only way to do that is to invest in systems because systems are self-perpetuating. Systems have a certain amount of salience and durability to them rather than programmatic outcomes that will die out when your money goes out. And so in a way, I feel like the pioneers of the folks that are in the narrow part of philanthropy, because the sunsetting folks that we're part of are like a fringe part of philanthropy. Majority of philanthropy in the United States, at least, is designed to be perpetual because that's the incentive structure, that's the institutionalism, that's the legacy. But I think the outliers, so to speak, are building this movement around saying, what does durable systems change look like? And going out and doing things that are fairly unorthodox, uncomfortable in order to do that systems change work. And that I think is increasingly also what we're realizing is takes away some of the institutional pressures you feel if you're perpetual. Because when I talk to my peers, one, you have to preserve the organization and its name. You can't have massive failures or small failures for that matter. And you're also limited by what you can pay out because you have to do the 5% a year because you have to keep growing the endowment. Even if you're doing a larger payout, like go to 5 to 6%, that doesn't really change much because you're still protecting the assets. That's the primary worshipping of you, what you care about. And so all of those are kind of counterintuitive to doing systemic change. And it comes back to Catherine's point again, like if you think about how you want to invest your portfolio, if you want to compete and make sure your endowment grows effectively, there's not a lot of wiggle room to do catalytic stuff there too, right? So all of those variables collectively to me feels like, there should be a wake-up call to say if you want to do systems investing or if you want to do systemic change, maybe the fundamental structure of how you're thinking about your assets and how long you want to last needs to change. And I do think we're seeing a lot more newer wealth holders adopt this model, but I think it's a provocative ask that I'm putting out to the community, so to speak, to say, is the structure of how you design from day one a big instrument of how you can create systems change or not? Johannes, does that answer your question? I know it was all over the place, but
It does, yes. Thank you. And I think it connects nicely to one of the questions that came in from Joseph, who wanted to know more about your impact measurement framework. I also remember we had some interesting conversations on that. Like, how does sunsetting relate to impact measurement? How does your strong focus on intuition and piloting and prototyping, how does that factor into impact measurement? So do you want to share a little bit about how you do that? What is your measurement practice? And how does that kind of connect to your intuition-led work?
yeah, we do annualized goal setting, which again, after all that feels like, wait, you do that? How is it possible to do when you're doing, like, you're feeling your way around it? And I think our core hypothesis here is often we set large systemic goals. Like, for instance, one of our goals this year is we want to unlock about $100 million of new capital to support childcare and early childhood in the state of Colorado. So a lot of this is outside our control in the traditional sense. So the biggest shift for us from an impact measurement standpoint is how, as you as an institution, set a goal that doesn't fall squarely in terms of being able to 100% be controlled by your own resources, which is the real existential question for systemic change. The same thing is true in housing. We set out a goal saying that we want to make Colorado a place where you could afford to rent or buy a home. And for majority of Coloradans, that needs to be less than 30% of their income. And a lot of that systemic outcome is dependent on a lot of other variables happening in community, where the markets are, potentially where the macro world is, where interest rates are, etc. So we do get, like, a lot of tension to say, how do you set that goal when you know that what you do might not be the thing that needs to the outcome, that what you do might be more like planting and creating the right ecosystem, and it may or may not happen. But we still measure ourselves against a set of systemic outcomes, if that makes sense from an impact measurement standpoint. And I will say openly that we do less of counting the minimal impact that we have directly. So we don't do a lot of, like, these many units have been funded by Gary, etc. And that's not to shy away from accountability. It's from more like holding the accountability of the overall systems in mind. Catherine, maybe, do you have anything else to jump in on? I know you were more tactical on this.
Yeah, I think we've been very intentional about laddering up in impact measurement that is not widget counting. Like, when we pilot something and we provide grant or investment capital to support that pilot, it's oftentimes not adding a side letter or a bunch of metrics for a manager or an innovator to report on, because we know that can be cumbersome and often get in the way of implementation. That said, and to Santosh's point, as a result, we are not as rigid on the impact measurement side, because we also have a board and an investment committee that can see the intrinsic innovation or intervention as the thing that we measure. So it's more of an outcome rather than an output mindset, and that takes a lot of support on the governance side to keep us in check and make sure there is accountability, but not focus very granularly on the outputs, and rather can see the outcomes and their translatability to broader scale and structures through policy and longer term investment structures.
Thank you. Johannes has got a problem with his audio, so I will ask the remaining questions. So we've got a question from Joseph. He is asking, how did you design Prop 123 to align with your capital strategy and theory of systems change?
You want me to take that one, Santosh? Yeah. And you can layer in. I'd say, so at a very structural level, we approached Prop 123 design. I'll go back to, I'm just hammering on these points, but essentially the cash flow. So, like, looking at cash flow from a community perspective, of a family's perspective, identifying the solution and the structure that works best for the cash flow of a family. And so we think about that in the States in a spectrum of AMI, of area median income, which is thresholds that are established by the government through the Housing and Urban Development Office. But that creates kind of a benchmark for us to think about how a family's cash flow maps to the solution. So from 0% AMI to 120% of area median income, which in Colorado for a four-person family is roughly 120,000, 130,000 US dollars at the higher end of the spectrum. The way that we mapped policy interventions followed that kind of spectrum. So we had done work previously on homelessness and mental health through a social impact bond here in Denver, allocated very high subsidy and like leading with subsidy dollars for the 0 to 30% AMI population, providing low-income housing tax credit gap debt to help projects that otherwise wouldn't get done for the 0 to 60% AMI. And Johannes did a great job of providing an overview of kind of where we saw those gaps. The biggest piece of Prop 123 was for us in the design process, the affordable housing financing facility or financing fund that provided concessionary debt and equity to workforce housing projects between 60 and 120% AMI. That was essentially filling the gap between what existed from public subsidy and federal tax credits and the market rate influences and incentives to develop, to essentially provide a state alternative to capital that brought folks from either end of the spectrum to require a lower blended return, which then requires a lower net operating income. Again, I go right into the details, but at a very high level, mapping the way that return expectations and markets behave and incentivize behavior to build more stock in that 60 to 120% AMI that essentially maps to the cash flow of families. And so working back from affordability, kind of designing those tools. That's like a very detailed response to that question, but
we love the detail.
Do you have any higher level commentary?
I would like to be noted that Catherine's a much larger nerd than I am. Just for the record.
Yeah, I fly under the radar sometimes.
I will. I mean, one other piece is like, even though we're standing here and taking credit for a lot of the Prop 123 work, it was built on, I think, layers on layers of innovations that Gary had done over a period of time. We'd been a long-term housing innovator. Sam, our founder, was really passionate about it. So everything from urban land conservancy, elevation community land trust, some of our early experiments, which became larger, and then a series of investments that Catherine led in some of the funds. And so we kind of like collated all of that and stood on the shoulder of all the kind of early innovation and said, and we repeatedly kept seeing that the biggest barrier all along is just large pools of publicly subsidized capital that needed to scale this dramatically. And so we said, what would it look like? And would it be possible to bundle all of that in a way to take those early experiments, because they're proven they work. And the primary driver of challenge there is lack of capital. So, and then on top of it, we made sure Catherine brought in her like broader modeling of saying, if you look at the system as a whole, how do you serve people across the income spectrum? So just want to add that little context to it in terms of how we got to the ideas that was actually finally kind of became law.
Great. Thank you, Santosh. We've got a question from Brittany. She says, how do innovators outreach Gary's team? Sorry, my cursor's going crazy. For systems change platforms, especially if we already have Prop 123 partners and a proven pilot. She doesn't want to bombard anyone, just wanted to ask, how do we get an invite to the next bar or happy hour? And you're all doing important work. You seem very genuine. So how can people reach out to you, get involved, identify partnerships, etc.?
Yeah, I would like to think we're accessible, but Catherine?
I was going to say reach out to Santosh.
No, I think Emily Williams runs our partnerships team, and I think we're actually being very deliberate about how do we bring in others along in this journey now. and it's a practice that we're building partly because I know we're going away. So we want we want 1,000 flowers to bloom, so to speak. So we can make sure we can leave one of our emails, in particular Emily's, as we leave this call, and specifically if if people are looking to get invited to things we do, or a lot of other foundations actually just making an open plug, come and do shadow days with us. We have one that's coming this Friday, where their entire leadership just comes and hangs out with us for the whole day. We have a blast and it's fun, and we usually do that with other folks too. So I think our primary focus is trying to bring asset holders and wealth holders to think differently about how they approach their work and what we can learn from them. So, open invitation to anybody who wants to say, "Hey, can we just come and spend a half a day with you guys, be a fly on the wall, and see how the system and how this works?" And we're very excited about doing that as we get to learn a lot from those experiences too.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we're still very much in the learning process ourselves. So like there's a lot of reciprocity in figuring out how to do what we're doing better. And we have 9 years to continue to improve and hopefully create a model for folks who also want to be impermanent in the future, where there is a playbook and a structure, and it's obviously contextual. But yeah, we are here in community to support the building of this kind of pipeline of ways that we can think differently about capital.
Great, thank you. That's a great invitation. Right, before we close, and just to say, we will be sending out an email to everyone who registered here with a link to the case study, so we can put any contact, any emails that you would like to share in there as well. Before we close, I wonder if you might let me ask you both a more personal question, if that's all right. Catherine, I don't have a quote from social media for you, but I can ask you the same question. So, Santosh, I read that you said you left India at the age of 25, boarded a plane for the first time with big dreams and approximately zero plan. What did you bring with you from your childhood that shaped the person and leader you've become today? And I will ask you the same question, Catherine, in a minute.
Yeah, that bio is formally not informal. It was written by Cloud Code for me, so I think I probably have to adopt it. I will say, I mean, it is true. I boarded a plane for the first time when I was 25, and I think that the childhood me would have never imagined that I would be standing here leading an organization focused on systems change here in Colorado, far away. I mean, I didn't even know where Colorado was on the map for a long time. I knew the U.S. existed because everybody knows the U.S. exists. And so the biggest thing I've taken with me is that I've always believed that unexpected people in places with power and privilege can do unexpected things. And Sam believed that, and our founder, and he always had like a tendency to bring in unorthodox folks to come and work with him, and he himself was an embodiment of that idea. And I would say if anybody walks into a Gary office on a random day, you will find some really unexpected people doing unexpected things. You will find a former investment banker, again, working on a piece of policy and testifying at the Colorado Capitol. Or you might find somebody who ran a network of schools now building a new tech platform for homeownership. So I am a big believer that systems change requires people who are from outside the system to come mess it up and reimagine it. By bringing talent that is so embodied and entrenched in the system is not a way to change the system. And I'm a big believer that bring in weird, crazy people with like expectations that they never had this kind of power in the world, and give them the resources, and magic happens. So, and I think I'm lucky to now build a team and a culture that embodies it. And I would re-emphasize the need for that part of our work in the philanthropic community to be central part of how we think about this, especially this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine.
Mine's less interesting, but I am a middle child with 2 brothers that is deeply, deeply justice oriented. Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the same systems change work that we're trying to do requires catalyzing the momentum of existing systems, but changing their direction. And so thinking about looking structurally at what is not working for most Coloradans in our in our context, and flipping kind of where the value that has been directed to much more concentrated sources of power and influence, and using those same structures to point them and that power and that influence to other folks is kind of the creative intrigue that looks pretty stagnant from the outside in, but there's so much opportunity, especially with our organizational infrastructure, to think about how that can work differently for folks. And it comes down to, for me, justice for folks and having a fair shot at opportunity. And so using those structures, pointing them in different ways to redistribute how that power shows up in the world is very similar to me, getting the soccer ball when we're playing keep away in the backyard.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I know what you mean. I had an older brother, so great. Well, look, that brings us to a close. Just a few last bits of information before we say goodbye. If you know TCI well, you'll know that every year we have an annual convening called the Systemic Investing Summit. The next one, the 2026 one, is coming up in about a month's time. Catherine is going to be there. So if you're going to be there, you'll see her on stage. We've persuaded her, I think, to get on and deliver one of the panels, which is brilliant. If you don't know about it, or if you haven't registered and you'd like to go, I've put a link there in the chat. I should have made a better link, but it's a Google Doc. It's a Google form, and you can fill that in and tell us that you want to come. And then we review those pretty much every day. So we'll get back to you pretty quickly. It's a really amazing gathering. There'll be about 150 to 200 people there. It brings people from the systemic investing community from all around the world, from investors to foundations to creatives to field builders, indigenous leaders, researchers, change makers, everything you can think of, but the most wonderful, brilliant, pioneering people. And it's not about listening to speeches. It's very, very practical. It's practitioner led. It's co-created. So you kind of roll up your sleeves and get stuck in as well. And we have really good parties alongside it, really good food, and it's really fun. Just like you said, we take the work seriously, but not ourselves so seriously. So do fill that in if you'd like to take part. I missed the most important piece of information, which is that in April it's going to be held in Rio in Brazil. So if you're Brazil based, or if you're from anywhere in the world and you want to join, just fill in that form. Also keep in touch with us on LinkedIn. All of our work and things like our case studies are shared there. That's the best place to keep update with us. But you can also sign up to our newsletter on our website. And I will send an email to everyone who has registered here with all of those links, and the emails also I can see that Santosh has put in our chat as well. So all that remains then is to say a huge thank you to Santosh and Catherine. We're really grateful for you sharing your important time with us. I know you're very busy, you've got lots to do, but it's just so valuable to hear about your work firsthand. And hopefully what we want to do is just to share this work as widely as possible, to inspire others to believe that this is possible and start making it happen. So thank you. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. And that's it. Thank you very much. We hope to see you soon.